Good evening. It's good to see you yet again. I'm glad that you have chosen once more to be here. I know the Lord is appreciative of your choice as well. If you have your Bibles, I pray that you do. Be turning over to the book of Colossians. We'll be continuing our study as we preach our way, study our way through this particular book. We are going to be looking tonight at Colossians chapter 3. The verses under consideration this evening will be verses 18 to 21. And our goal this evening is just really to do a brief overview of the home, because really verse 18 could be a sermon all on its own. Verse 19 could be a sermon all on its own. Verse 20 could be a sermon all on its own. And even verse 21 could be a sermon all on their own. And so although they won't be 4 individual sermons, we will look briefly at each 4 of those points and understand God's home and the way that He would have it to be. You know, I find it interesting in the beginning of time when God created all things. One of the very first institutions that He ultimately established, really the very first one, was the institution of the home. There with Adam and Eve, and they clave together and they were one flesh, and we'll deal with that here a little bit within this lesson. And then Adam and Eve, of course, would go on to have children. Of course, we know Cain and Abel, and then ultimately Seth would be born, and then of course many other sons and daughters would be born unto Adam and Eve. And so you have that first institution, if you will, that God created, that God set up, and that God established. But sadly, it is that institution that is under attack in our world today, especially in our country. When you think about the home, from individuals, from the homosexuality issue to the transgender issue, the home is a wreck. People do not want definite terms anymore. I was listening to this thing the other day. I was riding around, and this individual that I was riding around with, he had on I don't even know what you call it. It was an AM station, basically like public talk radio or something. They were talking politics, and so I don't listen to any of that. But a guy made a good point about the whole transgender and the fluidity role of men and women. He said, just think for a moment, ladies. He said, imagine yourself, you have a husband and you go into this dark alley and a guy jumps out. He's got a gun. He's ready to harm you. He's ready to rob you. And he said, which would you rather have? Would you rather have that husband that steps between you and the bad guy, fulfilling his role as the male? Or would you rather have that husband that jumps behind you, not fulfilling his role as a male? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, ladies. I think we know which choice you would choose. But there is defined roles for individuals. There's even defined roles within the home. And you know, one of the things that I love about God is God is always straight to the point, and God has always left a blueprint for the things that He wants done. And it is no different when it comes to the home. And so you go there to Colossians chapter 3, and we're going to pick up reading here in just a moment in verse number 18, as Paul is going to be giving or really going over God's blueprint from the home. But what I can't help but separate from this issue, because what we'll always do, we'll look at Colossians chapter 3, in verse number 16, and we deal there with the issue of singing, and rightfully so, we deal there with the issue of a cappella singing, and then we always say, you know, I find it interesting that the very next verse that Paul deals with is doing everything by God's authority. Well, don't you find it interesting that he says you need to do everything by God's authority, and then he gives the blueprint for the home? Make sure that your home is ran by God's blueprint. And so we're going to deal with first the wives, because we're just going to deal with it in the very order that Paul deals with it. And so we're going to deal with wives first, as we'll see there in verse number 18. Then we'll deal with husbands, as we see there in verse number 19. Then we'll deal with children, as we see there in verse number 20. And then ultimately we'll deal with parents there at the end, there in verse number 21. And so God's blueprint for the home, dealing with wives first. There in Colossians chapter 3 and verse number 18, he says, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as it is fit in the Lord. And so Paul starts off this discourse. Paul starts off giving this blueprint on the home by dealing with the wife. And he tells the wife, he says, listen, you need to submit yourself to your husband. And notice, to your own husband. And so ladies, you don't have to submit to somebody else's husband. Understand, you are to submit to your own husband as far as the marital role is concerned. Now, some people, they like to come to this verse, and we're also going to go over to Ephesians chapter 5 because it's a parallel thought, and they see this idea of submit. They see this idea that the wife is to submit to her husband. And you'll hear, oh, look there. There's the Bible. It's an outdated book. It's God taking the woman and suppressing her. It's God taking the woman and not loving her and not caring for her. Well, nothing is further from the truth. I heard an illustration one time in a sermon that has stuck with me, and I believe I've probably reused this illustration in my own preaching, but if you'll allow me to use this illustration once more to show you God's care and concern for woman. If you go back in your Bibles, you can turn there if you want, but you know the story, right? To the creation account. And in Genesis chapter 1, you have God creating all things, right? And then you get to Genesis chapter 2, and you have a divine commentary on the sixth day of creation. Don't be like some people who think, oh, God created all this stuff, and He ended His created works at the end of chapter 1, and then He went and He did some more creative works, because that's not how it happened. What you have in chapter 2 is a commentary on what's going on specifically with the creation of mankind. And you remember when God created Adam, He took the dust of the earth and He formed it together and He breathed into man the breath of life, and at that point mankind became a living being. And if you remember, Adam was given a task. Adam, you need to go and you need to name all of God's creation. All the animals and the things that are going to come before you, Adam. And you get the job, the privilege, if you will, to name these creatures. Well, if you remember there, as Adam is all these creatures are passing by Adam and he's naming them, it says that there was not a helpmeet found suitable, or some translations will write, and I think maybe a better translation, there was not a helpmeet compatible to him. And so what Adam needed in a helpmeet, what Adam needed in a wife, didn't exist yet. And so God understands it's not good for man to be alone. Now, ladies, note the care that God takes for the creation of woman. He could have just easily said, let there be Eve, and what could have happened? There could have been Eve, right? He did it with light. Let there be light, and what was there? There was light. He could have easily once more taken the dust of the earth and He could have formed it together once more and He could have breathed into that the breath of life, and there you could have had Eve. But that's not what the Bible says God did. What did God do? He takes Adam and He causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. And He opens up the side of Adam and He takes a rib. He takes part of Adam. And out of that, He creates Eve. The care, the concern that God has for woman. And so back to Ephesians, not Ephesians, we're going to go to Ephesians chapter, back to Colossians chapter 3 really quickly. You see this idea here where Paul says that wives, you need to submit to your husbands. Now the word submit here literally means to be subject to or to be subordinate to, but understand this is not a master and slave relationship. That's not what it is. It's the idea of individuals that are working together, women understanding their role and understanding their, Lord willing, their godly husband, and their godly husband is going to fulfill their role. Look over at the book of Ephesians. Because I said, you may put a marker here in Colossians, or maybe you want to put your marker in Ephesians chapter 5, because we're going to be going back and forth between these two chapters because they are parallel thoughts. They are parallel ideas. And so, notice here in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 22, it says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husband as unto the Lord." And so Paul elaborates a little bit more. As you would submit to Jesus, as you would do the things that He would ask you to do and have you to do, submit to your husband. But notice, he doesn't just stop there. He says, here's the reason why. "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and He is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be unto their own husbands in everything." And so these individuals, the wives, are submitting to their husband, not being run over, not being a slave, but submitting to their husband. Now, that does not mean that the wife has no decision-making. No, the wife is there with her husband, and they're making decisions together. But at the end of the day, the husband is the one that is going to answer to God for being the head of his house. And too often times you see, and I don't mean to be, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. It'll come to me in a minute. But too many times we have ladies that are trying to be the head of the household. Now, sometimes they're forced into that situation because maybe the husband isn't around. Maybe the husband isn't around because he was a worthless, no-good dog and he ran off. Maybe the husband isn't around because maybe there was an accident. Maybe he lost his life. And so sometimes you do have ladies that unfortunately have to be put into that headship role. But sometimes you have ladies that they just stick their nose where it doesn't be. I'll never forget it. I remember one particular elder at a church, and I won't tell you where this is because some of you may know where this is, but I remember this elder. He come to an elders meeting and he said, "Well, we need to discuss this because my wife said we need to discuss it." Are you kidding me? You're going to discuss it because you're an elder of the Lord's church and it's something that needs to be discussed, not because you were told to by your wife. So wives need to submit themselves to their husband. As a matter of fact, Genesis chapter 2 in verse number 24, the married couple becomes one flesh and they're working together for God. You know, isn't that a beautiful scene that you see played out in Genesis chapter 2? Here you have Adam and he's one individual. Then part of Adam is taken out. It's created into a whole other individual. And then God brings the two back together to become one flesh. God takes one, He takes a part of it, now you have two, He brings them back together to be one flesh. And the only way that they can be one flesh is if the husband is fulfilling his role as the husband and the wife is fulfilling her role as the wife. Now, if you go back to Colossians chapter 3, this idea of submitting, this idea of placing oneself under, being willing to be led by her husbands. Notice why. As it is fit in the Lord. That's what Colossians says there in Colossians chapter 3 verse 18. Now Paul gives the example as the church is subject to Christ. But here's this idea about as what is fitting. This carries the idea about what is being proper according to the commandments of God. And so someone may look at this and they say, "Well, I don't like the idea of submitting, but I still want to be faithful to God." Well, if you want to be faithful to God and you want to be a faithful wife, then you have to submit. But understand, it's not, as we've already pointed out, it's not the master-slave relationship. But you know, here's what I tell ladies all the time, because sometimes you'll have maybe ladies that come out of the world and they're not, they don't know God's plan, and they say this idea, "Well, how am I supposed to submit to my husband?" Here's the thing, ladies. If you have a godly husband who is fulfilling his God-given role, then submitting is easy. Is it not easy as a child of God to submit to the will of God because God does everything that He's supposed to do? Absolutely it is. It's easy to submit to the will of God because He's doing everything that He needs to do. And so, you talk to, and I guess, we got Miss Olivia back there. I don't want to forget about her. She'll get a little bit older here in a little bit for our young ladies that are out there. I think about my 3 girls. I think about Miss Mayana sitting right there. I think about Olivia sitting back over there. Listen, you're going to grow up, and some young man is going to catch your eye. That's the way it's supposed to work. First of all, make sure it's a Christian young man. As I heard this said before, that there is going to be a man that rules your household. But here it is. You get to choose who it is. It doesn't have to be some heathen off the street. Make a wise choice. Because I'll tell you, if you make the wrong choice, it makes submitting a whole lot harder. Look over at the book of 1 Peter. I want to show you something here before we move on that I think is, important to our discussion. Notice something that Peter would write here. He's going to write there in 1 Peter chapter 3. And notice what Peter says here in 1 Peter chapter 3, starting there in verse number 1. He says, "Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation or the conduct of the wives. Why, they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaited hair, of wearing of gold, or putting on apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God a great price. For after this manner in old time the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement." Now he's going to go on to talk about the husbands. But notice specifically what he says about the wives, specifically in verse number 1. He says you need to be in subjection to your own husband, even if it's someone that hasn't obeyed the word. Now, we have to understand here, there is the exception, right? Because what does God always want someone to do? His will has to come first. And so he's saying here, wives, you need to subject yourself to your own husband, even if he's not a believer. Now, I do want to put this disclaimer here, because some people will run to this verse and they say, look, it's okay to marry a non-Christian. And I know that this subject gets touchy, but I want you to think about something. When we marry someone that's not a Christian, have we put God first in that decision? Is this someone that you're marrying that is going to help lead your children to God? Yes or no? If they're not a Christian, how can you answer that question? Yes. Let's be honest about it. Whether you're talking about a husband, whether you're talking about a wife, if they're not a member of the Lord's church, can they help raise your children and get them to heaven? The answer is no. They can't do it. How can they bring someone to the Lord's church if they themselves are not? They're certainly not putting the Lord first in that decision. And so, if you're in that situation, I am not condemning you. Please don't misunderstand that. But what I am saying is, for our youth, that's an important decision that you need to make. And I can tell you, because someone without a doubt will always say, well, I know of so-and-so who married their spouse and they were able to convert them. And I love hearing those stories. I really do. But for every one of those that you can find me, I could find you about 10 more where that's not the case. I can speak from personal experience. I've seen my mother cry many a tears because my father, even to this point in time, has not obeyed the gospel. And she'll call me on the phone and say, he's not interested in these spiritual things. He won't go to church services with me. He won't go to gospel meetings. And I had to tell her, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you have to go through that. But that's a decision that could have been avoided a long time ago. Now, on the selfish side, I'm glad she made the decision to marry my dad because I'm alive. But do you get what I'm saying? You can avoid a lot of hardships in your life by making that decision correctly. And I'm talking to men and women. Marry somebody. But the point that Peter's making here, and in the context, it's someone who is a believer that has fallen away. But he says, if they're not obeying, he said, you continue to submit to them unless they forbid you to go to church or something like that. But by your actions, by your godliness, you know what you might just do? You might just bring them back to the Lord. You might win their soul. But I tell you what's never going to happen. Ladies, you'll never ever be able to win your husband back if you're not fulfilling your godly role. Because he'll look at that situation as like, well, you want me to do this, but you won't even do that. Think on those things. All right, go back to Colossians chapter 3. We picked on the wives for a little bit. Now let's pick on the husbands. Verse number 19. I told you each of these verses could be a sermon on their own. We're going to have to speed up just a little bit. Husbands, love your wives, and be not bitter against them. Paul now turns his attention to the husbands. And here's the thing. If the husbands will do this one very thing, and there's more involved to it than this, but if the husbands will do this one simple thing, then it will help the wives out so much. Now, it seems simple, but this is what Paul says. Husbands, love your wives. Now, in the Greek, this is a present active imperative. And so that's just a way that says, husbands, you need to love your wife from the moment that you say I do, and hopefully you loved her before you said I do. But you love her from the moment that she becomes your wife, and you continue to love her. It's not just a love her one time and then I'm done with her, but love her and continue to love her. Matter of fact, consider this. Put a marker right here real quickly in Colossians chapter 3 and turn over to Ephesians, because this is, in my opinion, a beautiful thought. Look at Ephesians chapter 5. I want to look just at a few verses. Look at Ephesians chapter 5 and look at let's start in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Move on down to verse number 33. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife sees that she reverences her husband. And then you go and you look at Colossians chapter 3 and verse number 19, which we just read, and you see there that husbands are commanded to love their wives. Now there's 5 times in those passages we looked at. It occurs twice in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 25. It occurs once in Ephesians chapter 33, and it occurs again in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 19. That's actually 4 times, not 5 times. My math is a bit wrong. But 4 times there, the command is given, husbands, love your wives. Now, the word love there, it's also in verse 28. There's the 5th time. We didn't read that verse. Ephesians 5 verse 28. I knew I had 5 on there. I just didn't mark it on here. Ephesians 5 verse 28. And you see that there as well, the idea of love. But each time the word love there is used, it's the Greek word agape. It's the sacrificial love. It's that type of love that's found in John chapter 3 verse 16. The love where one takes their own interests, their own desire, and they set it aside for somebody else. And so 5 times in these passages, Paul tells the husbands, agape your wives, agape your wives, agape your wives. Well, here's the beautiful thing. In Colossians 3:19, the word agape actually appears in the verb form, and it's agape-et, which means it's an intelligent and a purposeful love, which is far more than just mere affection. It's not just saying I love you and giving a peck on the cheek. But it's the idea, that illustration that was given earlier, when that guy comes out in the dark alleyway to harm your wife. Husbands, what are you going to do? You're going to step in between your wife and that guy, and you're even willing to give your life for your wife. Is that not what Christ did in verse 25 of Ephesians chapter 5? Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church, and note this, and gave Himself for it. You know, there's a lot of people in this room that I love dearly. But if somebody walked in that back room and they threatened to kill each of us, the first person I'm jumping in front of is Sarah. I'm sorry. It's the first person I'm jumping in front of. And I'm sure the first person George would jump in front of is going to be Linda. Steve's going to be jumping in front of Judy. Jacob and Javion, they're going to jump in front of their mom. That's the type of love. Ladies, that's the type of love that you're looking for in your future husband. If your future husband doesn't show you that type of love, he is not worth your time. Young men, if you're not willing to love your wife that way, you don't deserve a good wife. Husbands, love your wife. It's not just enough to say that I love you. You have to show it. Husbands, we have to show our wives each and every day that I love you. Not just on Mother's Day. You know, I've seen a bunch of posts today, you know, husbands telling their wives that they love them because of the mother of their children. That's great. Will you still tell your wife tomorrow that you love them because they're the mother of your children? I hope that you do. We have to love our wives. All right, now let's pick on the children. Verse number 20. Go to Colossians chapter 3. Verse number 20. It says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. And so he's dealt with the wives, he's dealt with the husband. A husband and wife come together, and now they have children. And so even children have a role in which they must play in God's home. And he says, children, obey your parents in all things. Children must be obedient. The idea of obey here is to take heed, so to listen, and then to do. But it's not just as the husband loving his wife wasn't just a one-time event, but no, it was the husband loving his wife and continuing to love his wife. So it is with the children that they obey their parents, and here it is, they continue to obey their parents. You don't just get to say, well, you know, Mom, it was Mother's Day, and so I did whatever you told me to do, but tomorrow, good luck. You're on your own because I'm not listening. No. Can't be that way. Children, we have to obey our parents. You know, here's the thing. Children don't always like to admit this, but you know what? Mom and Dad, they know what they're talking about. You know, I remember being a kid thinking, you know, my mom and dad would tell me something. I'm like, why in the world do I got to do this? This is so dumb. But you know what? I look back on that and go, you know what? They were right. And I even look back on decisions that I made in my life where I'm like, you know what? I wish I would have listened to Mom and Dad. They were trying to tell me to do something that was right. And I didn't want to do it. And so he says, children, obey your parents. Notice this, in all things. So children, if you have a godly father and a godly mother, I promise you, they have your best interest in heart. They're not just telling you to do something or not do something so they can hear themselves speak. You know, I tell people all the time that's why I became a preacher. I like to just hear myself talk. That's not really why I became a preacher. But parents, or children, your parents did not become your parents just because they wanted to hear themselves speak. They became their parents because they made a decision as husband and wife, and God blessed them with you. So yes, even though your parents may not admit it to you, children, you are a blessing. You're a blessing from God. But understand, a blessing from God, you now have been given into the care of your parents. And your parents are going to give the best advice that they can coming from God to raise you in a good way. And so it's the children's responsibility to obey their parents. But if you need to know, if obeying your parents isn't enough because it's a smart thing to do, Paul gives some reasons as why children should obey their parents. Right here in Colossians, he gives the reason, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. If we were to go around and we were to ask the children here this evening, do you want to be pleasing to God? I have no doubt that they would say yes. Well, in order to be pleasing to God, children, you must obey your parents because it's pleasing to God. But you know, you go over to Ephesians chapter 6, and Paul here is going to give some other reasons as to why you should obey your parents. Look there at Ephesians chapter 6 and verse number 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It's the right thing to do, children, for you to obey your parents. Number 2, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And so you go back to the Old Testament and you have really the idea there in Exodus chapter 20, you have the 10 commandments are given. And Paul is relying on that. He says, listen, this is the first commandment that God gave that has an actual promise. Well, what is that promise? Well, there's two things that are mentioned there. In verse number 3, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. That it may be well. That your life may be well. Let me tell you. Children, your life will be a whole lot better if you listen to mom and dad. I'm not just saying that because I'm a parent. I'm saying that because that's what the Bible says. Your life will be better. Your life will be easier if you listen to your parents. But then he goes on to say that thou mayest live long on the earth. Now I always think about that promise in twofold. And really to understand the twofold part, you have to go back to the Old Testament. Because in the Old Testament, there was a deal within the law of Moses. If you had a rebellious child as a parent, you know what you as a parent could do to your rebellious child? You could take him before the elders of the city, and you could say, listen, this child is rebellious. He won't listen to the things that I have to say. And the elders would say, okay, let's take care of it. And they'd take that kid outside the camp, and they'd throw a bunch of rocks on his head until he stopped living. That's bad English, but good understanding. In other words, children, if you were disobedient under the old law, your mom and dad could kill you. I know that sounds harsh, but your mom and dad could kill you. You're a rebellious child, you're not listening, I'm going to stone you. But you know what? That served as a great object lesson for the younger kid. The younger kid sees the older kid got taken outside and stoned. I'm not doing what he did. I always tell that story about my brother, right? I know I've told it here before, but my brother, one time, my older brother, he thought he was all big and bad. He went to school, learned some not-so-nice words. He come home, used those not-so-nice words in front of my mom. My mom yanked him up, threw it on the counter, washed his mouth out with soap. I said to myself, I will never use that word again. At least not in front of my mama, because I'm not tasting soap. It's a good object lesson. That's why that provision was there. But children, if you obey your parents, you can live long. Well, you're not going to be stoned if you're obeying your parents. But you put that in today's application, it's really a promise for God that you can have, on average, a longer physical life if you listen to mom or dad. And you certainly have a great shot if you have godly parents on having a good spiritual life if you listen to mom and dad. All right, real quickly, we've got about 10 minutes left, which we probably won't take all those 10 minutes. But look at verse 21. Now we need to deal with the parents. So we dealt with the wives, we dealt with the husbands, we dealt with the children. But it is the case that parents themselves even have roles that they have to do. They have things that they have to do for their children. And so notice there in verse number 21, he says, Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Now, he does specifically mention fathers here, but understand this would be the parental role, and so mothers, you would be just as well to apply to this as well. And so he says specifically here, Fathers, provoke not your children to anger. But the idea of provoke here means to stir up, to excite, to arouse. And so don't bring your children, don't set your children up in a way to where they're going to be angry, to where they're going to think that their life is terrible, lest they be discouraged or lose heart or become dispirited. Look over at Ephesians chapter 6, as we're bouncing back and forth between these parallel passages. Look there at Ephesians chapter 6 and verse number 4. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. And so there's what he mentions in in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, but notice what else he adds here. But. So don't treat them in this way, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I struggle with that word all the time, so just bear with me. Bring them up in the encouragement of the Lord. Instill in them that God is God. Instill in them basic Bible facts. You know, I'm always so encouraged on Sunday mornings, and they're not here, so I'll pick on them. But I'm always so encouraged when we have Billy and Bertie and Tommy and those little kids, and they go downstairs with Kima, and Kima teaches that class, and I know, Linda, you help out down there. And someone may look at that, well, why are you teaching Tommy? Like, why are you taking Tommy down there? You'd be surprised what Tommy's picking up. I heard Deborah telling Linda a story this morning. I wasn't trying to be nosy. I was just up here flipping out the communion. And she was telling the story about the song, Building Up the Temple, and how Tommy was just into that song. You know, right now, that song may just be a bunch of this to him. But as he gets older, those songs are going to start to register in their minds. You know, I always think of Miss Scarlet. We all love Miss Scarlet. She's not here. But that song, The Fuzzy Little Caterpillar. And to her, that could have just been, at a young age, a cute song about a caterpillar. But what's it teach? It teaches that God is the creator, not evolution. Little things like that. Bring our children up in the Lord. Instill in your children at a young age that God created this earth. It wasn't evolution. Instill in a young age that God's rules for marriage. Why do you think each truth seeker, we end with 3 particular questions, one of them being on marriage? Because the world will tell you that that's not how the home is to be established. Instill those things in your children. Grandparents, instill those things in your grandchildren. Bring them up in the Lord. Don't discourage them. Don't bring them to anger. But bring them up in a loving home, teaching them about God. There is so much more we could say on each of these roles as far as the home is concerned. And believe it or not, that was just simply an overview. There are so many verses that we didn't even have time to discuss, so many things that we didn't have time to discuss this evening. But I hope maybe you have just a little bit better appreciation of the home. I hope maybe you have a better appreciation for how God would have things today. You know, I made comment this morning that you could see a decline in our country after World War II when the home was really broken up. And now you have both parents outside the home, and you have children that are either raising themselves or being raised by another individual. You'd be surprised the world of good it would do if man would just establish their homes the way that God desires. People talk about, sometimes, the world is crazy. Well, how do you get the world better? Well, you got to get within the church. You got to get the church out into the world. But then sometimes people look at the church and like, man, the church is falling apart. How do we get the church better? Well, we got to start at home. When we understand the importance of home and raising our children and being godly husbands and being godly wives and being godly parents, then that translates to the church. And now we're raising godly Christians. And that translates into going out into all the world and having more godly homes established, having more godly Christians brought up. You want to change the world? You want to change the church for the better, to improve, not to improve upon what's there, but to help make the things that are wrong right? It starts at home. Because let me make this point real quick and then we'll close, I promise. Parents, do you realize that your children, if you were to come to just Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, and Sunday morning Bible study, do you realize that's only 4 hours? You send them to school and typically they get 8 hours at school. 8 hours in one day, and typically they go 5 days a week. And so that's 40 hours of worldliness. I'm not saying that school's bad. Don't misunderstand me, although there are some schools that are bad. But that's 40 hours of worldliness compared to, sometimes you don't even get this, but 4 hours with members of the church. You realize that's a 10 times difference. And so what do you have to do? You have to make sure that you instill these things in your home. I know our lesson this evening has not been one of evangelistic nature. I know our lesson this evening hasn't even really been of one of maybe a fallen Christian that needs to come home. But it is the case that we want to make sure that we offer the Lord's invitation. We would never ever want to leave somebody in our audience that may be wanting to respond without an opportunity to do so. And so at this point in time, we extend unto you the Lord's invitation. Not my invitation, not the Olathe Church of Jesus Christ invitation, but the Lord's invitation. And so if you're here and you're not a child of God and you have the desire to become one, we can help you in that need. If you're here this evening, a child of God that has fallen away but wants to come home, we can assist you in that need as well. Whatever your need may be, please let it be known as together we stand.